Has anybody spoken yet? I can't hear anyone.
Hi there.
Oh, hi. Okay, working.
As you are entering in, you are welcome to introduce yourself in the chat if you would like. We'll give it a few minutes for people to join. Welcome, Karen and Matt. Glad to have you here. Got some new names here, I think. Looks like we have several attendees from Victoria Hospice. That's great to see. Hi, Mandy. Hi, Shannon. Just hang on for a couple more minutes here. Still have people popping in. Those that are still joining us now, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat if you would like. Hi, Maria. Okay. We'll get started pretty quick here. So, hello everyone. My name is Jillian and I am the Interim Program Manager for the Victoria South Island Long-Term Care Initiative. Welcome to our LTCI Learning Series event on honoring Indigenous knowledges in palliative care. It is with great respect and appreciation that I'm speaking to you from the traditional and ancestral territories of the Sauk Nation, where I am very lucky to work and live. Just a couple of quick housekeeping notes before we get started. First, please keep yourself muted. Background noise tends to carry and can get amplified pretty quickly. If you have any questions during the evening, please hold them until the end, and we will leave ample time for discussion. There are CME credits available for tonight's session. Someone from the LTCI team will be reaching out next week to send you a certificate for your records. Additionally, towards the end of the evening, we'll ask you to fill out a quick evaluation. It only takes a few moments, and your feedback really helps us to improve these events. Finally, just so you know, tonight's session is being recorded and will be posted on our website afterwards. Last but not least, I would like to introduce our presenter for this evening, Dr. Holly Prince. Dr. Holly Prince is, and you have to forgive me if my pronunciation, I practiced a lot, but Anishinaabekwe. That was terrible. I'm sorry. I did much better earlier. Anishinaabekwe, and a member of Opwa Ganisinning. Opwa Ganisinning. Sort of? Okay. I apologize. In Northwestern Ontario, Holly's research focuses on decolonial and Indigenous education, health equity, and the resurgence of Indigenous knowledges. She leads the Indigenous Peoples Health and Aging Division at the Center for Education and Research on Aging and Health at Lakehead University. She has devoted the last 20 plus years to advancing the right of Indigenous peoples' access to culturally appropriate and equitable palliative care, and has mobilized her efforts as a national champion of human rights and dignity for people preparing to journey back to the spirit world. I hope you will all join me in welcoming Dr. Prince. We are very lucky to have her here tonight. And maybe you can show us or give us an example of how to pronounce those things properly.
Absolutely. So I'm just getting my slide deck up, and if you can let me know if you can you see this okay? Yes? Okay. So bonjour, I would like to welcome everyone into this space today, and extend my gratitude to the organizers for inviting me here to speak with you today. So bonjour, we Juwea na Dishnakas, Anima Gozagin na Donjiba Makwado Dam. My English name is Holly Prince. My spirit name is Wiijue, which means the woman who goes along or journeys with people. It was given to me in a vision a year after my mother had died, and she's the beautiful woman in the green sweater. And it is said that our spirit name is the name we had before we came into this world. And when we receive our spirit names, we know who we are in creation, and everything else that has a spirit, including the animals and plants and rocks, stars, and ancestors, can hear us. I come from the Makwado Dem, the Bear Clan, who are the medicine people in Anishinaabe communities. I was born and raised in Beardmore, Ontario, home to the world's largest snowman. Google it, it's true. In the summer, he carries a fishing rod, and in the winter, he carries a curling broom. And here I was raised on my traditional territory surrounding Anima-Gozagigan, also known as Lake Nipigon, pictured above. And that, my friends, is no filter needed. That is my traditional territory, and that's how it looks every night. And it is the ancestral territory of my family where we have lived and thrived for over 6 generations. I am a registered Indian and member of Opwaganisinning, which is translated to where the pipestone comes from, which is a signatory to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. I have lived in Thunder Bay for over 20 years now on the territory of Anemki Waju, also known as Fort William First Nation, where I get to see Nana Bajo, or the sleeping giant, every day. I live here with my husband, who is also Anishinaabe from Anigaming First Nation, located in the Treaty 3 territory, along with our 3 children. I am a social worker by background and have a PhD in educational studies from Lakehead University, really centering on decolonial and Indigenous education. And I'm deeply committed to reactivating and revitalizing Indigenous knowledges and healthy caregiving networks to decolonize care for Indigenous peoples at the end of life. I lead the Indigenous Peoples Health and Aging Division at the Center for Education and Research on Aging and Health at Lakehead University in Thunder Bay. And our division has 2 main goals, to partner with Indigenous communities to lead culturally relevant research and education with them, and to create that space to amplify Indigenous peoples' voices through knowledge translation and program development. And I tell you all of this about myself because locating myself in my work ensures accountability and authenticity to the communities that I work with. It also decolonizes my research. And so as I present my thoughts and teachings and stories to you today, I also acknowledge that I'm sharing these stories and teachings through the lens of my Anishinaabeg worldview. So one of the 7 sacred teachings as Anishinaabe is the teaching of humility. And this means knowing yourself as a sacred part of creation and recognizing that you are standing here on the shoulders of others and building upon their knowledge and wisdom. So I want to acknowledge my ancestors, including my mother, for providing me with the love, the foundation, and the strength that have enabled me to be here today. I also want to recognize the many elders who have guided, mentored, created space for me in order to share their teachings with you all from their families, communities, and nations on my journey. So a couple things I'm hoping to do with you today is to really talk about the health inequities experienced by Indigenous communities and to really explore the significant contribution that equity-informed approaches to care can make on the health experiences of Indigenous peoples. And lastly, I want to share with you some strategies that can challenge existing systems and programs and practices of health and social care providers to really shoot and aim for that culturally safer care for Indigenous people. So Harley Eagle is a colleague of mine that I work alongside, and he recently did a presentation for the University of British Columbia Learning Circle. And in this presentation he did on cultural safety and addressing racism in the healthcare system, in his presentation, he really outlined a learning process for cultural safety. And so first he says that we have to create that space and the capacity to hear and to embrace the discomfort and to learn from one another. And it's about acknowledging that the work that we're going to be doing tonight is going to be very difficult because it challenges our values and our beliefs and our worldviews. It challenges our privilege. He then talks about the need to learn from the past and current realities and to embrace knowledge, and not only Eurocentric westernized knowledge, but to realize that there's other forms of knowledge out there that have been missing from our stories, from our realities, from our past and present. He then says that once you have the knowledge, you can then develop those skills to navigate the past and present day realities. And lastly, he then describes that organizations and individuals need to hold off on actions until they have that knowledge and skills gained through that learning, through relationships, through the discomfort, because these inform action. So this is what we're going to be doing today. So first, we're going to create a space to hear and to embrace discomfort and to learn from one another. So I want you to take a moment to think about how you would describe your feelings about the session as a starting point in our discussion. I don't want you to share it or put it in the chat. I just want you to put this at the forefront of your heart and of your cognition. So perhaps you were excited to see that this was a topic for the session. Maybe you were feeling a little bit optimistic. Maybe you were ready to engage in some of those hard decisions and discussions. Or perhaps you were feeling a little bit cautious or anxious or unsure. Perhaps you're feeling a little bit guilty because you already know about the history of Indigenous peoples and their relationship in Canada. So I want to recognize that these discussions around inequitable access to healthcare, anti-racism, and colonization are difficult. Being here presenting this information to you as an Anishinaabe is difficult and at times can feel very unsafe. But I come to this discussion recognizing my responsibility in this relationship with you all in this virtual space, really reflecting on what is it that I can bring or add to this conversation. As non-Indigenous peoples, these discussions may also be difficult for you too, because you have lived within this system. And some of these things we're going to be discussing, these biases, these values, this lack of knowledge or understanding, may be so entrenched in your worldview that you cannot see it or have not seen it. These discussions can also bring up feelings of guilt or shame for the tragedies that have happened in the past. But this is not about feeling guilty for what has happened in the past. You nor I can change the past, but we are all accountable for what we do next and acknowledging our responsibility in moving this conversation forward into action. So this work that we're going to be doing together tonight is about being open and being willing to accept our roles and our privileges, which can be uncomfortable because it requires us to be vulnerable. So I encourage you to be comfortable with the uncomfortable. So really embrace that discomfort that comes from moving from where you're at to where you want to go. There was a reason why you came to this session today. So if there's anything that I say in my reflections this evening that kind of makes you feel uncomfortable, I encourage you to sit with it and reflect on it and use it as an opportunity to grow. So I have been working in the field of palliative care for over 20 years, and during this time, I have come to understand the immense health challenges faced by Indigenous peoples. So Indigenous peoples in Canada are the fastest growing segment of the Canadian population, with an increase in the numbers of over 40%, more than 40 times, 4 times the growth of the rest of Canada. We have relatively poor health outcomes compared to the rest of Canadians. So our life expectancy is up to 15 years shorter for Indigenous peoples as compared to other Canadians. Our rates of chronic and terminal illnesses are also higher amongst Indigenous peoples when age adjusted. And the occurrence of chronic diseases and illnesses increases with age, with approximately half of Indigenous peoples aged 60 years or older reporting 4 or more chronic health conditions. And palliative care is increasingly being promoted as a basic human right. We advocate for this. We understand, we agree that everyone should be provided with the opportunity to live and die with dignity. But yet, despite the emphasis on improving access, we still have a profound lack of equity for Indigenous peoples. So there is a lack of ownership and accountability in determining which level of government, the federal versus the provincial or territorial, is responsible for delivering health services to Indigenous peoples. In addition, responses to addressing the needs of those 3 distinct groups, First Nation, Inuit, and Métis, also vary between the groups, as evident in our current legislation. So in Canada, the federal government is responsible for funding health services in Indigenous communities through Indigenous Services Canada's First Nations and Inuit Health Branch. And people who live anywhere else outside of a First Nations community receive their health care funded through provincial and territorial governments. So this differing approach creates this policy gap in service delivery, and it really creates barriers to seamless transitions and access to quality end-of-life care. So this jurisdictional gray area is a barrier to the provision of health services for Indigenous peoples. And this is really evident when it comes to hospital discharge planning and the problems that occur when discharging clients back to Indigenous communities. And this is probably my favorite quote by a palliative care physician that came out in some national research that we did with First Nation communities a number of years ago. And it really speaks to how services and those barriers and those gaps are really highlighted and amplified when working with Indigenous peoples. We're also seeing a lack of formal healthcare providers in community, as well as timely access to medication and equipment. Caregiver burnout is a huge concern where healthcare providers working in Indigenous communities are the family, they are the sons, daughters, nieces, and nephews of the people that they're providing care for in a professional capacity. Communities are also in a fluctuating state of crisis due to things like traumatic death and suicide, which at times can overshadow that natural dying process and expected deaths. Racism within our healthcare system continues to be a significant issue that impacts access to quality care for Indigenous peoples, and there's a lack of culturally safe services and care. So what we know is that Indigenous peoples would prefer to receive care in their communities and by their own community healthcare providers. But the majority of people have to leave communities to receive care because of these challenges. And they die in regional or urban hospitals, long-term care homes, and hospices, really displaced from their communities, culture, traditions, language, and families. So I want to discuss with you this evening the significant contribution that equity-informed approaches to palliative care can make to Indigenous people's health experiences and their access to care. So equity-oriented care is really about directing adequate resources to those with the greatest needs. It doesn't mean treating everyone equally because everyone doesn't need the same thing. And I recently heard this from a shelter worker who stated, I approach care with this philosophy, quote, if someone needs it, they deserve it. So in identifying equity-oriented approaches to care for Indigenous peoples, in particular at the end of life, we have to unlearn colonial logic that really disregards Indigenous peoples' knowledges regarding health and wellness, caregiving, dying and death. And these models of care must be based on Indigenous peoples' values, principles, and worldviews, with equity-oriented approaches to care embedded within the healthcare system and providers' practices. And those Indigenous concepts of health and well-being have to be accepted with support given to Indigenous health systems. And those structural systems and policies imposed through colonization need to be challenged, with healthcare providers being willing to challenge their own power and privilege in these relationships. So over the next hour, we're going to be engaged in a discussion on how we can improve the care for Indigenous peoples who are seriously ill by addressing the need for culturally safer care. And we're going to begin this discussion by sharing, I'm going to share with you some shared foundational principles within Indigenous worldviews regarding health and wellness and some of our cultural aspects around death and dying. So as Harley Eagle stated, knowledge is about us learning from the past and current realities. And the first reality that we're going to explore is the recognition and honoring of Indigenous knowledges. So when I speak of Indigenous peoples, I recognize First Nation, Inuit, and Métis, and acknowledge that there are many diverse values, beliefs, and practices across and within Indigenous communities regarding care for people who are very sick. But there are, however, some shared foundational principles within Indigenous worldviews which frame how we view ourselves, our role in the world, our connections, and our relationships, and really our responsibilities to one another. So the Thunderbird Partnership Foundation really highlights some of these shared foundational worldviews. And the first one they talk about is that the spirit is the most fundamental feature of an Indigenous worldview. So as Indigenous peoples, we believe that we are spirit first, journeying through this physical life. So we are spirit beings having a human experience. And we talk a lot about circles because they're reflective of wholeness and balance, as in the circle of life. This concept of all my relations, what that means is that we are all related to one another and we're responsible for maintaining good and harmonious relationships. And we're all related to one another because we are all a part of Mother Earth. Our Indigenous worldviews also center on this concept around and this belief that the universe cares. So that includes the Creator, that includes Mother Earth and all the beings. We also talk about the path of life continuum. And what that means is that we are living in this world, and it's really understood as a journey of our spirit moving through stages of life that are interconnected and continuous. So we are never alone on these journeys because our lives are also not only connected to the people here on earth, but we're also connected to our ancestors and to those yet unborn. I want to spend some time really talking about how we view health and wellness. So, Elder Jim DeMont is an Anishinaabe elder located here in northeastern Ontario. And he really describes that Indigenous people's view on health, wellness, and balance is really about that holistic connection. So, it is about people's spiritual, physical, emotional, and mental aspects of ourself. It's also, though, centered on connections. So you're not an individual. You are connected to your family and to your environment. And the teachings of this wholeness and balance also translate across the life cycle because it ties to the knowledge of caregiving, dying, and death. So if we go back to that previous slide, so it's the acknowledgement that spirit is the most fundamental feature of an Indigenous worldview. We therefore recognize dying as a spiritual process, one that is sacred. It's a natural part of our life cycle, and it's really understood to be that transition back to the spirit world to Creator. So death in our communities is viewed as a social and community event with caregiving provided by family and community. And family and community networks are important to Indigenous peoples. And that concept of kinship is woven throughout the fabric of our culture. And as Indigenous peoples face end of life, those connections to family and community may be more valued than access to specialty services. And the involvement of family and community may also reflect respect for traditional protocols and values at the end of life. So, preparing for death really involves many cultural and traditional community based practices, which is really about ensuring that that person is strong enough to transition back to Creator. Our connection to the land is also important for people who are dying, as they're both a spiritual and relational approach to the land. And when I think about our language, this is another beautiful teaching by Elton Beardy. And he really talks about how our teachings are embedded within our language. And when you break down parts of the words, they can hold such powerful understandings of our culture. And when we reflect on the impact of colonization, language was the first and primary thing as a result of colonization that occurred, the removal of that language. And you can see how our teachings are embedded within that language, and the loss of that language was detrimental to our teachings. So when I talk about caregiving and caregiving from an Indigenous lens, that concept of family really extends beyond bloodlines, between family and community. And, you know, in Indigenous communities, they really believe that those two are inseparable. And so when you look at this diagram, it's really noted with that dotted line that it's porous. So There is no such thing as a nuclear family in Indigenous communities. And that's why when people are journeying back to the spirit world, the entire community can gather to offer support, to keep vigil at the bedside. And it's really about ensuring that person is ready. So when I'm speaking with the elders, they talk about that really crucial role that family and community play in meeting a person's spiritual, physical, emotional, and mental needs. So when we think about our dying and death ceremonies, our teachings and our languages, which were demonized, colonization forcibly removed this knowledge from our communities. The teachings that helped to prepare us and support us when somebody was dying were replaced with ideologies and teachings that were not our own. So colonization impacted something so sacred as our dying. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of 2015 stated that without truth, justice, and healing, there could be no genuine reconciliation. The problem with this is that there are too many Canadians who know nothing or very little about the ongoing role and impacts of colonization. And what I would say is before truth, there has to be trust. And right now in our healthcare system, there is a severe lack of trust from Indigenous peoples when they enter that healthcare system. So when we look at equity-oriented approaches to care and we recognize that there's other ways of knowing, being, and doing, there's other knowledges that are not integrated or a part of our westernized healthcare system. The other thing that we have to do is we have to push back. We really have to challenge these colonial structures, including our healthcare system, because it continues to disempower and cause harm to Indigenous peoples. So now we're going to really kind of take a step back and we're going to explore that knowledge. We're going to look at the past and our current realities and are going to start unpacking some of these truths today and discussing how Canada came to be and that ongoing impact of colonization experienced by Indigenous peoples. So our Jardine and Lyons from the University of Saskatchewan state that addressing Indigenous health inequities really requires focusing on changing underlying structural determinants rather than just addressing symptomatic effects. So those structural determinants include the continuing impact of colonization. So this is a really great diagram by Mi'kmaq scholar, Dr. Charlotte Loppe. And this diagram really outlines those structural and those social determinants of health. So when discussing inequities, we tend to focus on the leaves of this tree. So those are those determinants that have a direct impact on the health of individuals. So a lot of our responses in society are around treating these or supporting these. So for instance, providing people with educational opportunities, supporting food banks, for instance. So we might even go one step further and acknowledge those systems like education, like health, like justice, social welfare that are really responsible and have that direct allocation, that direct impact on the allocation of resources and supports. And we might recognize those systems need to be changed. So within these environments, though, equity or inequity is demonstrated through policies and programs and practices, as well as how we address barriers. So, but like the roots of any good tree, we need to focus on those deeper issues, those structural determinants that support that tree. So those are the foundational elements. So those are those really deeply embedded ideological and political roots that shape all the other determinants. So the integrity of these foundations determine health equity and thus the wellness of entire societies. So those structural determinants of health for Indigenous peoples really center on colonial ideologies and colonial government. So I'm going to share with you right now a short little video, and this is a video in my other role outside of Lakehead University as a senior advisor and project lead to the Canadian Virtual Hospice. So I help support the Canadian Virtual Hospice in their livingmyculture.ca project. And this is a project that was funded by the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer, where we had the opportunity to go across Canada and listen to Indigenous elders and knowledge carriers, health and social care providers, as well as those living with serious illness and their family members. So I'm just going to show you a short video.
Kill the Indian, save the man. So it was a term that the United States did with their First Nation people in Canada, implemented through the Indian Act, and forced the children of the Native people to India residential schools. So they did that for a number of generations, and have damaged us, and lots of harm happened to us in, physical, mental, sexual, spiritual abuse, and our whole purpose in life is to raise a better next generation. But if you take that purpose away, who are we? And we get disconnected from the land, from our roles and responsibilities to each other. So for a number of generations, we're like lost spirits or wounded spirits, and we're harm ourselves or other people, because when we're hurt, we hurt other people, and we end up hurting ourselves. So you see a lot of social indicators which First Nations people are overrepresented. We may be a sliver of the population of Canada, but in poverty, jails, mental health, all these things were overrepresented. So until the social indicators are more to the true population of Canada, I say there's still things like racism in the political system, legal system, the education system, the health system. And working in a health system, I have witnessed myself, I've seen. So I do try to promote a lot of trauma-informed care, because people don't, Native people and non-Native people aren't really aware of the true history that happened to our people and why we suffer so much. Drug addictions, suicide, murdered and missing Aboriginal women and children are all symptoms of systemic issues. And those, until we deal with those things, it's going to be continuation of much the more of the same, I should say. Working at the hospital for the last 10 years, the last 2 years especially, I've seen the demand for the services greatly increased. So it's getting, and you see the state of the world, how crazy it is out there. It's, we're on tilt, and mankind's on tilt because we don't know how to honor each other. Everyone serves a purpose, and if we're not doing that purpose, the gaps get bigger. There's no reason we have poverty on this great turtle island, right? Because we could serve, there's everything we need on this land. So the corporation, the governments, and the people are getting separated. And as a result, these people are becoming more hurt, more sick, more separated in all areas.
So many of you might be familiar with this quote on the slide, and this really speaks to the intention of colonization. So it was about the eradication of Indigenous peoples. So in Canada, there was no greater institution, policy, structure, or public face of structural racism than colonization. Colonization was based on racism, the belief that one group is superior to another group. And colonization defined whose knowledge is valued and whose knowledge was privileged. Colonization is the primary cause of poor health in Indigenous peoples. It is also the foundation for the lack of equitable access to healthcare in Canada for Indigenous peoples. And colonization not only happened in the past, but it continues to create harm and negatively impact Indigenous peoples. Colonization forced policies and legislation onto Indigenous peoples to assimilate them into Euro-Canadian culture through the Indian Act. And these policies and institutions included things like the reserve system, which is still here today, the Indian residential school system, the enfranchisement policy, to name a few. But in addition to these systems, our westernized Eurocentric health system was also driven by colonialism. So when we think about the planning, design, and imposition of Western medicine on Indigenous peoples, it invalidated our effective Indigenous knowledges, our healers, our practices, our caregiving models, and really fostered a deep sense of internalized oppression. So it replaced our traditional healing with biomedicine. Indigenous peoples were treated as objects of the healthcare system for the purposes of research and experimentation. So Indian residential schools were the sites of many scientific research experiments. And because Indigenous children were the direct wards of the government, they could not voluntarily consent to participate. There was a segregated health system for Indigenous peoples, which included segregated hospitals that were severely underfunded and had very low standards of care. And these hospitals were developed to alleviate white settlers' fears around the communicability of tuberculosis. In 1953, the Indian Act was amended to include the Indian health regulations that made it a crime for Indigenous peoples to refuse to see a doctor, to refuse to go to the hospital, to leave the hospital before discharge. And the RCMP could actually arrest patients and return them or send them to jail. So all of these policies, all of these systems, all of these processes resulted in intergenerational trauma, struggles with poverty, violence, addiction, suicide, and poor health outcomes. So within the National Inquiry into the Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls of 2019, Indigenous leaders and activists called out these colonial systems as genocide, as they directly impact and increase rates of violence, harm, and the extermination of Indigenous peoples. So Dr. James Makokis, who is a Neheo from Saddle Lake Cree Nation, he's also a family physician and the winner of Season 7's Amazing Race Canada. He offered a really critical insight into this issue during a keynote at a recent anti-Indigenous racism conference. And he stated that when filling out death certificates for Indigenous peoples, the most accurate cause of death to list on these forms is colonization. So this statement really underscores the fundamental reason behind poor health and that ongoing harm faced by Indigenous peoples. And in recent reports, the magnitude of racism within our healthcare system as it relates to Indigenous peoples, in particular Indigenous women and girls, has been exposed. This impacts Indigenous people's willingness to access healthcare, which negatively impacts their health and well-being. And it's important to note that racism impacts not only the people who access the healthcare system, but also Indigenous peoples who work within the healthcare system. And we continue to invalidate Indigenous knowledges and caregiving models. So when we think about providing care to Indigenous peoples who are very sick with life-limiting or life-changing illnesses, we frame this discussion within the context of palliative care, introducing concepts around advanced care planning, consent and capacity, and being very open to talking about dying and death. So we come to this relationship in palliative care from westernized medicine and from Eurocentric knowledge. This is the system that we are talking about, and this is what Indigenous peoples are expected to fit in with. So these services designed to support Indigenous peoples at end of life, grounded in that westernized knowledge, will never truly be safe for Indigenous peoples. And this is something that Elder Albert McLeod shared. And he said that unless healthcare systems are completely dismantled and rebuilt by Indigenous peoples, the term culturally safer care may be more appropriate, as it shows that there has been some effort by the system to recognize and challenge those structures that maintain the colonial state of inequities. So we need to acknowledge that our systems, including our health system, does not support Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. So this does not take away from all of the health and social care providers who are good people or who are doing good work. It means, however, that we have to acknowledge that these systems were never designed with Indigenous ways of knowing in mind, and were never designed to keep Indigenous peoples healthy. So I'm going to show you another short video, again from the Canadian Virtual Hospice. Oh, I took that one out, sorry. So when we speak of cultural safety, it's really recognized that cultural safety only occurs when Indigenous peoples tell you that they feel safe. So it's not up to the Indigenous person or that family or the community to teach or to direct the organization. They can participate in those discussions, but it's really our role as healthcare providers to ensure that we are delivering patient and family-centered care in safe spaces. And it's that organization's responsibility to ensure that they are creating those safe spaces. So what can organizations do to create safer programs and services for Indigenous peoples? As Elder Dave Cushane said, that the best way to create these Indigenous partnerships is to, quote, get out of the box and back into the circle. So I want to take this moment and I want you to think about these. And again, I don't want you to answer any of them out loud or share them in the chat. I just want you to think about them and reflect on them. So truly think about why Indigenous peoples, why are they accessing or not accessing your services? And what are your policies in your organization for getting consent? And are Indigenous communities represented in your organization's decision-making processes? Are the people that you serve reflective of your organization's staffing? Do you know who to access for translation services? And are you accessing the right language or dialect? So these are questions that I always pose back to organizations. And it's a great opportunity to take these questions back to your organization, to really think about these as a group and as a collective, to figure out what's the direction that your organization needs to take. So in an article by Alan and team, which included Elder Dave Cushane and Elder Berman Bushi, they really described the importance of Indigenous-led healthcare partnerships. So they talked about, to go to ceremonies and community events, to connect with Indigenous peoples. Whenever I do this in person, I always ask people to raise their hand. How many people have gone to a powwow? How many people have participated in local ceremonies and community events within Indigenous communities that are in their area? How can you promote authentic engagement and relationship between people and organizations? Encouraging people to speak out in solidarity during professional and public forums to honor and appreciate medicines of Indigenous peoples. How do you create Indigenous safe spaces? And again, there's a lot of research and a lot of work out there led by Indigenous scholars who are articulating ways to create these safe spaces. So how do you create ceremony rooms? How do you create smudge-friendly rooms in your hospitals and clinics? In Ontario, we have the smoke-free policy. In our policies in Ontario, we actually have provisions within there that make it mandatory for organizations to create indoor spaces that allow Indigenous peoples to use smudging and or tobacco for ceremonies. That is something that we have in Ontario, and there's actual fines that will be allocated if an individual healthcare provider doesn't respond or if an organization cannot provide that. So we have taken that to the next level, and we have advocated for that within our provincially funded healthcare system. How do you create those partnerships with local Indigenous knowledge carriers to provide education? How do you direct and develop elder circles to promote system level change and really working with those local elders to provide cultural education for your staff? So when I think about systems, systems are really big. Hospital systems are really big. How do we actually change? How do we change those systems? We change those systems through our individual providers' practices. It's about challenging our own power structures and our own privilege to really create spaces for respectful, authentic relationships and care. So cultural safety requires that healthcare providers exercise cultural humility. And this cultural humility is really what can contribute to a culturally safer system. So this is about, engaging in that critical self-reflective practice, looking at our power, looking at our privilege. How do you engage? How do you enter that relationship as a learner? How do you enter that relationship with a lens of humility to acknowledge that you are not the expert in that relationship? So there's a couple of things that people can do to really practice everyday enactments within their journey around practicing from a lens of cultural humility. So I encourage you to take responsibility for your own learning. So the first thing I always do to encourage people is to learn about the territory that you live on and the names of those traditional custodians of the land, and learn how to say these names properly. I appreciated the effort that was made to say my name and the community that I was from at the beginning of this presentation, because what that showed me was an individual who had made the effort um, to say it properly. And that's important. So I encourage you to practice them, to show people that you're making the effort, to do your own research, to read, to ask people. I do a lot of work across Canada, and I do not speak every single language from different nations across Canada. So I too have to go to the Google and I look at how to say these community names, and I break them down phonetically, and I look at media releases and things from their websites, and I look at how they say the name, and then I actually break these down phonetically so that when I go into a community, I have shown that I have made the effort to say their names properly. I also want you to acknowledge that there is a difference. So if your first thought was to go, why is the session only talking about Indigenous peoples? Why aren't we focusing on the Italian population or the French population or the Dutch population? It's because of colonization. The issues that Indigenous peoples experience is different compared to any other culture. So we as Indigenous peoples come to healthcare experiences with over 150 years of colonization embedded in structural violence and harm. So our experience within that westernized healthcare system is different. I also want you to be cognizant of language. Don't use language like Canada's Indigenous peoples or our First Nations. We don't belong to Canada. No one owns us. Use wording like Indigenous people who live in this country that we now call Canada, or the First Nations communities that we work with. Recognize that these relationships involve two or more people. So in order for you to develop trusting, respectful relationships with people, enter that relationship in a humble way. Acknowledge that you are not the expert of that relationship. You might come to that relationship with a lot of knowledge and experience as a physician, as a nurse, as a care aide, but within that relationship, you are not the expert. So take the lead from the people that you work with and make that effort to understand and learn what values and beliefs are important to that person. So we know in palliative care that we use the patient dignity question. So what do I need to know about you as a person to give you the best care possible? Ask them. Is that the first question that you are encouraging your staff to ask when working with a client? If not, why not? It's a great question which really opens up conversation. I encourage med students to start off with that question first. When I work with an elders and knowledge carrier circle from across Canada, representing First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nations, they had all said that if their healthcare provider led with that question first, their relationship with that westernized healthcare system probably would have looked a lot different. And recognize that we all make mistakes at times. Acknowledge them, to reflect and learn from your mistakes. That's a really tough lesson. And we encourage children to do it. I think adults have a tougher time acknowledging that you made a mistake and not adding on with the but, not adding on with an excuse. Just acknowledge that you made a mistake and that you're sorry for what you had said. And really about creating that space for reflection. So be aware of your assumptions, your biases. Question everything that you have learned about Indigenous peoples. Where did you learn it from? Who taught it to you? Maybe it's so inherent in your day-to-day life that you don't even know where that bias came from. Question everything you did not learn about Indigenous peoples. So why didn't you learn about residential schools or treaties in elementary school?
It's important to recognize when we're working in the north that number one, we have a significantly higher Indigenous population than the rest of Canada. So Yukon is 24 to 25% of our population is Indigenous, whereas the rest of Canada is 3 to 5%. So healthcare providers are going to see significantly more Indigenous patients in their practice here than they likely would in a bigger city or an urban center. And so that is fundamental that they have an understanding of what does it mean to understand and work with people who are First Nations, what might be some of their core beliefs or values, what might be some of their interests in receiving health care, what do I need to know about you and your culture to provide you the best care possible. So once we understand what someone's values and their history are, we also need to know that that doesn't transcend to every single person. So people's experiences with residential school are radically different. Some people went for a great number of years, never returned home. Some went during the week and went home on weekends. Some were able to go home in summers. And everyone carries their trauma and that history and experience differently. And so as healthcare providers, a part of providing that person-centered care is getting to the root of what is important to you, how can we provide this care to you, and how can we provide it in a way that doesn't further traumatize you. In the jail system, so outside of healthcare, we hear about things like bed checks and going into someone's room and tapping the end of the bed with your foot to wake them up is significantly triggering. Not only is it disrespectful, but it's triggering to go back to that residential school when someone might come to your room in the middle of the night and wake you up by tapping your bed with their foot. We might not always have forewarning on what those challenges might be, but we can also get support and cues from family. So what might be difficult for your loved one? They might not have the full answer as to this happened, so this is why it's difficult, but they might be well able to say, Mom doesn't like being woken up with the light turned on in her room. And then we can understand that and we can put that into the care that we can provide. And we can help other family members understand that if maybe only certain people are holding that information.
So again, now I just wanted to pause and take a moment. And I want you to think about the following questions. And I do this intentionally so that people have the opportunity to connect with some of the things that I'm saying with their emotional part of being. And so I want you to think about, how would you feel if police showed up at your door and took your 4-year-old child away from where you live and put them in an institution hundreds of kilometers from where you live? How would you feel if you found out that your child was abused and mistreated by the adults that were entrusted with their care? How would you feel if you were forced to move to a completely different and unknown area? How would you feel if it was illegal for you to practice your familiar or cultural traditions? How would you feel if it was illegal for you to leave your community without a pre-approved pass from the government? How would you feel if you couldn't access clean drinking water in your community? How would you feel if one of your family members went missing and no one responded or made an effort to find them? How would you feel if the government could tell you whether or not you were Italian or French or Dutch? And how would you feel if someone didn't listen to your medical concerns in a hospital simply because of who you were or what you looked like? So we need to challenge our privilege. And privilege, somewhere along the way, the word privilege has caused a lot of discomfort for people. And it's almost become a dirty word. We have to recognize that in our positions, in the places and spaces that we work, each one of us holds power. I, as an Anishinaabe Kwe, am highly educated within the westernized education system. I work within that westernized healthcare system. And when I enter community, I recognize that I hold power and privilege when I go in to work with other Indigenous peoples. So, as Charmaine Whitman says, it's really about taking up a space around the medicine wheel as part of their circle of care. So, when we think about how we go about challenging and advancing your personal practice, you can begin by reflecting on your own biases. Commit to personal development. Prioritize getting to know your families and the patients and their stories. Acknowledge some of those injustices affecting health and action. So Brittany Packett Cunningham, who's an activist and educator and leader at the intersection of culture and justice and policy, says, your role in social change starts 2 steps past where you feel comfortable. So find that place, take 2 more steps past there, and that's where you need to begin. So you need to be there every time, no exceptions. It can be something small, like when you hear somebody telling a racist joke over a dinner. Don't remain silent, call them out. For Orange Shirt Day, don't just wear a shirt. Find other ways to create awareness within your families, within your programs, within your institutions. Support local initiatives for fundraising for residential school survivors. It could also be those big things which require you to take risks and step outside your comfort zones. When you hear about an Indigenous nation protesting a pipeline, or the poisoning of their water, or the destruction of burial sites, read, learn about it, call them, ask how you can help or support. Remember that the risk that you take pales in comparison to the risk that Black people, Indigenous peoples, and people of color live with each and every day. So recognize your own privilege and use this to create safer spaces for Indigenous peoples to amplify their voices, to really celebrate those strengths and resilience. I work with elders and they say we are more than a resilient people. We are a relentless people, because even after over 150 years of colonization, we continue to engage in acts of reclamation of our knowledges. So also in looking at how you can challenge and advance your personal practice, engage in daily acts of reconciliation. So when people want to talk to me about reconciliation, I'll ask them if they've read these 4 seminal documents. So the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, the Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Final Report, the Truth and Reconciliation Report, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And if they haven't read them, I won't engage in discussions with them because they haven't even done their own homework. So do your work. There's also a lot of learning opportunities out there, free learning opportunities, and this is a great one that I would like to promote with you today. So these are learning modules on Indigenous cultural safety training, looking at advanced illness, palliative care, and grief. And these are free online learning modules developed at the Canadian Virtual Hospice, which really provides practical strategies to incorporate cultural safety into healthcare work. They feature the lived experience of Indigenous peoples, of Indigenous scholars and healthcare providers, and they really help to increase our healthcare system's capacity to respectfully engage with Indigenous peoples and improve the quality of care for those living with advanced illness and their families. So that's what I'm here to do with you today, to recognize that if I share some of my knowledge and teachings with you today, I may impact and inspire some of you to engage in this work further. And even if it's just 5 of you in this virtual room, I know those 5 can have a ripple effect on, say, those 10 Indigenous peoples that you may care for over the year, which will then impact those 50 people's extended families. And it really creates that ripple effect to those communities and nations that you care for. So as a collective, that's how we change practice. That's how we change policies and programs to be culturally safer for Indigenous peoples. So embracing a health equity oriented approach is really a crucial step in improving the health outcomes and end of life care for Indigenous peoples. It's about challenging those colonial systems that have created the disparities in the first place. It's about ensuring that care reflects Indigenous peoples' physical, cultural, and social experiences, values, and beliefs, with spirituality and kinship and relational accountability as the foundation for frameworks and approaches to care. So, in the wise words of Elder Betty McKenna, who I've had the privilege of working alongside for a number of years and learning from her, rather than living for this moment, we should be living our lives thinking that we are someone else's ancestor. And with that, I would like to say miigwech, which means thank you, bamapi, which means until we meet again. So in my language, in Anishinaabe there is no word for goodbye. We say bamapi or goabamin, which means until we meet again, because we truly believe that as spiritual beings, we will all meet each other once again. So miigwech. Does anyone have any questions?
Oh, thank you.
I'll say too, if anyone wants to pop any questions into the chat, we'd be happy to read them out for you. Are you able to see the chat
Yeah.
there, Holly? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, miigwech everyone for being here and listening and reflecting. And again, I encourage you guys to take a look at the Canadian Virtual Hospice. A lot of our resources are on there, as well as I encourage you to engage in some of your own learning and unlearning of colonial logic. And if there's any questions that you guys ever have, you know where to reach out to me. I'm right at Lakeage University. You can put me in the Google, you will find me, and miigwech.
Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate you taking the time. And we hope to have you join us again sometime in the future.
Miigwech. Bum up here, everyone.